Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks Podcast, powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. The Cougars have a new athletic director, Brian Santiago. He's the new head man of BYU Athletics. That was announced after business hours on Tuesday night. So we're breaking that down here on this edition of the Cougar Tracks Podcast. You can follow me on X, Instagram, TikTok occasionally. Mitch_Harper, and then also follow KSL Sports at KSL Sports and download the KSL Sports app today. So again, BYU announces on Tuesday that Brian Santiago is officially the athletic director at BYU moving forward. It concludes a 3-month search. It was a national search, according to BYU. And they zero in on Brian Santiago, who was the deputy athletic director and has been part of the BYU athletic department since 2001. He's been involved with BYU athletics in some capacity since 1997, dating back to his days as an assistant staffer in the BYU men's basketball program under Steve Cleveland. BYU president C. Shane Reese, who was the first BYU president to make a athletic director hire since Cecil O. Samuelson did it back in 2005, when he hired Tom Holmoe. President C. Shane Reese writes in a statement, quote, "We are excited to build on the forward momentum and legacy of Tom Holmoe, who is retiring with the appointment of Brian Santiago as BYU's next director of athletics. Brian has a track record of leadership and an ability to lead BYU athletics as we navigate the complex and rapidly evolving waters of college athletics. It's become clear to me throughout this search process that Brian will seek to strengthen BYU's academic and spiritual mission, and he understands how it blesses the lives of our student athletes," end quote. That was, again, BYU President C. Shane Reese announcing the hire of Brian Santiago. Brian Santiago, new BYU AD, he writes in a statement, quote, "I am humbled and honored for this responsibility and privilege to work alongside our coaches, staff, student athletes, and all of Cougar Nation. BYU is one of the premier athletic programs in the country, but it is so much more than that. It is part of BYU's sacred mission. We are blessed with incredible leadership in President C. Shane Reese and Vice President Keith Vorkink, as well as the university's board of trustees, chaired by the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We are here to build student athletes academically, athletically, spiritually, and to prepare them to go make a difference in the world. As an athletic department, we stand united in this charge," end quote. Big shoes for Brian Santiago to fill for Tom Holmoe, but keep in mind, Brian Santiago's been there every step of the way. As Tom Holmoe has talked about in previous interviews with myself and other outlets, he's noted that Brian Santiago has been basically his right-hand man. Brian Santiago was involved in the BYU basketball coaching search to get Kevin Young. He was also involved in the football program extending head coach Kalani Sitake. You know, the reaction on social media is kind of mixed to this hire. To me, I think this hire is solid. One, because Brian Santiago, I think, can level up the athletic department from what Tom Holmoe has done. I think in the last 20 years, BYU athletics has been good. It's been solid, but it hasn't been great. There hasn't been many championship banners hung in the main sports, football and men's basketball, the revenue-generating sports. And I would argue also women's basketball, as it continues to rise in an elevated platform in college athletics, that's going to become more potentially of a revenue driver. There hasn't been enough championships hung. Everyone can talk about the Olympic sports, and those matter a ton in the athletic department profile. BYU has strong athletics right now. Strong. But to break through and take it to the highest levels, Brian Santiago is incredibly competitive, and I believe he's someone that can level it up. Now, I think you got to ask yourself, what does an athletic director do? Some of the key pieces to what an AD is going to do: hire great coaches, keep donations flowing. He was involved in the head coaching search of Kevin Young. Brian Santiago has oversaw basketball, baseball, softball. The baseball program, a little bit underwhelming. Hasn't been great at all. The Kevin Young hire, home run. I mean, that's probably putting it lightly, the Kevin Young hire that Tom Homo and Brian Santiago took part in. But Brian Santiago, heavily involved with men's basketball, and that program has taken off. And there's also a belief in Kalani Sitake by locking him up to a long-term extension. So now you have the three leaders of BYU athletics: Brian Santiago, Kalani Sitake, Kevin Young, into this new era of the next media rights deal with the Big 12. The Big 12's new media rights begins this year and runs to 2031. These are your leaders. And Brian Santiago has got to make sure those guys have everything that they need to succeed at the highest levels. And the rest of the athletic department too. But you need these revenue-generating sports to be operating at peak performance. That's going to be the challenge for him, to get it to even higher levels, break through to a Final Four, get to the college football playoff. But hiring coaches is a big piece to athletic director jobs and what they do. Another big piece is fundraising. Ryan Smith, a prominent BYU alum, booster, Jazz owner, Utah Mammoths owner, he noted on the KSL Sports Zone a few months ago that what Brian does is magic. I'm paraphrasing, but you can go back and look at that piece. High praise from someone who's probably the most visible BYU alum out there in BYU's network of boosters. That's pretty deep. And continue to inspire those individuals to want to be part of BYU athletics and finding ways to enhance revenue streams and continue to get more. Look, me as a media member, sure, I'd love to be sitting courtside at BYU basketball games again. Do you think I like seeing some kid that doesn't want to be there sitting courtside with the Vivint iPad screen? No, but I also get it that this is a money game now, and you've got to find revenue streams if you're an AD, and someone like Brian Santiago has found ways to get new revenue streams. That helps the cause too. It's a competitive world out there in college athletics, and BYU is clearly neck deep in the game. To think that BYU, there was once upon a time when people would say, BYU is probably going to go to the way of BYU Idaho, of old Rick's College, and become a school with no sports. No, that's not happening. They've always wanted to operate at the highest levels. They're showing that more than ever in the Big 12. And I think that's exciting for Cougar fans, is that in these 2 years where Santiago has taken on greater significance within the athletic department, being Tom Homo's right-hand man, because Homo knew his job was done. Even though that the banners were not hung in high numbers in the last 20 years in the revenue-generating sports, Tom did his job, and he ultimately got BYU in the game, which was the Big 12. There were times where it felt like you were never going to see BYU at this stage. And look, the timing was absolutely perfect with COVID. It created the opportunity. The once-in-a-lifetime pandemic really was probably the best thing ever for BYU athletics because it highlighted its strengths. And 2016, too, they realized how deep their booster pool was back then with the whole song and dance with the Big 12 back then. But now they're in a position where they feel really strong. And these revenue-generating sports are ready to take off, and Santiago now leads the way going forward. But he's been involved with this, with the athletic department, seeing NIL, seeing revenue sharing, what the potential plan is for BYU in rev share. And that's something I think we got to keep in mind, too. As far as timeline, 3 months, it didn't shock me in the slightest that this thing stretched out 3 months to ultimately go to a hire from within. BYU took its time. They reached out to internal athletic department individuals, former student athletes, current student athletes, to get feedback of potential candidates internally and what maybe they want to see with the next athletic director role. And I think back to what President Shane Reese said at the press conference in February of what they're looking for in this next AD. He talked about, he wants someone that bleeds blue. That was one of the criteria. Someone that is all in completely on BYU sports. Brian Santiago fits that billing completely. The man didn't play at BYU. He was a sharpshooter in his days at Fresno State, gashing the Cougars. UVSC, Utah Valley State back in the day. JUCO transfer, ends up at Fresno. But the man loves BYU. He's all about BYU. So he bleeds blue. And then the next biggest piece for President Shane Reese, when they announced that Tom Homo was retiring for the next AD, Christ-like leadership. Now, I'm not going to be judging that because I'm not going to speak of who's Christ-like and who's not. I'm not the barometer on that. But that's something that's very important to BYU and the mission. But having that institutional knowledge of how BYU operates, how BYU views the upcoming revenue sharing era, because there is nuance to that. We've seen it clearly with the Church Education System Commissioner, Clark Gilbert, laying out the guidelines of how BYU views NIL deals. Never the highest bidder. He's right there underneath the church. That helps the process. For someone who's not familiar with BYU or maybe doesn't bleed blue to the fullest extent, it might be a huge whirlwind. And with how quick college athletics changes, it makes a lot of sense to just go to Brian Santiago. Now, I'm okay with it, a succession plan here, because I feel like the ball just keeps moving. There's a lot of great momentum. Kalani locked in for football. Kevin Young, 7-year deal with BYU basketball. Everyone's in place. The key revenue-generating sports, you are locked in. And you've had recent success. 11 wins for football. An Alamo Bowl win. Knocked on the door of getting to the Big 12 championship. The only reason why you were held out was because of tiebreakers. The NCAA tournament, you got to the Sweet 16. You got the number 1 basketball recruit. You've got big-time transfers in football. Got Keanu Tanavasa. BYU's in the game. So times are good. Why not keep it rolling? I'm okay with the hire. I think it's a solid hire. And I think, again, Brian Santiago can take it to a higher level. I think some of the things that are going to be fascinating to me going forward. How does he continue to inspire boosters to not have donor fatigue? When revenue sharing, and look, the House versus NCAA case is not completely settled yet, so we're still waiting on all the nuances that come with that. But how do you continue to inspire boosters to continue to pony up and donate at a high clip? Because you could get to a point where revenue sharing is involved, where the school's paying directly. Me as a booster, do I need to donate anymore? Is it needed anymore? Or do just the billionaires, are they going to handle it? Do I need to keep doing my part? How do you keep those people inspired? That's a big challenge. And look, he's going to have to round out his staff too. We'll get to that here a little bit later as well. But that's going to be something that's a big area to monitor for Brian Santiago. Number 2 to me, and this really is probably the biggest, having BYU in the game at the highest levels, no matter what. Look, in a perfect world, I think everyone that's a BYU fan would say, let's just have the Big 12 succeed. Let's just have the Big 12 continue to operate for the next 30 years at a high level. They love this. BYU fans love this setup. The Big 12, you can win it. You have access to the playoff. You have access to the NCAA tournaments, great seeds. There's cachet that comes with being in the league, great competition. This setup's quite nice. But I think we'd be naive to think that it's just going to stay status quo after this next round of media rights or for the next 10, 15 years. Something's going to change. We don't know what that's going to look like. It feels like when things are the quietest is when something drops and it becomes a massive shift in the landscape. Making sure BYU's always in a position and ahead of the curve to play at the highest stages of the sport, particularly college football and definitely BYU basketball as well. Making sure that they are at the highest levels. And that's where conference realignment and all the negotiations, the competitiveness, that's going to be always making sure you're ahead of the curve and being able to get around the influential decision makers that go into that. Some of that stuff, it's hard to project because USC going into the Big Ten, that was known by 4 or 5 people. I mean, that shocked everyone. Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC, even the Big 12 commissioner at the time, Bob Bowlesby, was blindsided. But still, putting BYU in a place where they will always be at the highest levels, because you don't want these good times to end in 10, 15 years if there's a seismic shift and the Big 12 experiences the fate one day of the Pac-12. You just always got to keep your antenna up and your guard up for that doomsday scenario, but you're still in a position to thrive. BYU, I think, could always find its place because, heck, they navigated football independence and the West Coast Conference and still was able to elevate its brand, its profile, its fan base, despite really, in retrospect, second-tier competition. I think fans just didn't know any better, but now that they've experienced it at a power conference night in, night out level, yeah, there's a big difference. And no one wants to go back to what it's been in the past. So conference realignment will always be big. I'm really curious to see how Brian Santiago rounds out his staff. Does he just continue to keep the current people that are in place on board? Who does he appoint as his deputy athletic director? Who's the person that he appoints to oversee men's and women's basketball? I think those are interesting conversations and questions. How does he shape this staff? Does he do a shakeup? You know, there were many people that when this job opened up that looked at Santiago, Chad Lewis, former BYU tight end in the athletic department now, and Liz Darger as 3 of the top candidates for the job. Can all those individuals still stay on board? Did they chase the job, or was it always Santiago's to begin with? It always felt like out of those 3, clearly Santiago was the candidate for the job. But does he shake things up at all? I'd be interested to see what he does in that direction. And the timeline makes sense too. You're at the final week of athletic competition on BYU's campus coming to an end for the 2024-2025 year. Big 12 spring business meetings coming up at the end of the month. So you give him the chance to settle in and be part of those conversations because that's important stuff. You know, part of me thought maybe BYU waits until there's a formalized deal with the House versus NCAA. But regardless, Brian's been involved. He's been aware of how BYU views revenue sharing. Tom Homo has kept him heavily involved. It's been a collaborative effort. So they just keep the ball moving. When that settlement goes down, BYU just kind of keeps the ball moving. There's not a steep learning curve in all of this. But there will be a kind of a made-for-TV press conference coming up on Wednesday morning, 10 a.m., that's kind of how BYU, I guess, does things now, where they do things at the BYU Broadcasting Building in a made-for-TV setup. I'll probably get a few questions in. We'll see, President C. Shane Reese, Brian Santiago, they'll be available to answer some questions. We'll see who all shows up. That's always kind of interesting at these press conferences, but I think it's a good thing for BYU. I think Brian Santiago is going to do a good job for BYU. Look, there's this mixed opinions again on social media. There's some detractors. There's some that love him. I think that's just how everyone is in society. You're not going to have everyone that's universally loved. I'm okay with it. Like, if you keep, like, BYU sports has never been at this high of a level ever. Like, they're fielding rosters and getting personnel that BYU never could dream of. You keep that momentum going. And Brian Santiago has been a part of that. Like, think about BYU basketball offering a 5-star prospect out of Oklahoma. I believe it's Jeremiah. His last name is escaping me right now. But they offered last week. And fans of programs in the power conferences were reacting to that and going, oh no, BYU's in the mix. Again, let that simmer a little bit. BYU jumps into the mix for a 2026 guy about 6 months before signing day for hoops. And fans of schools are then suddenly getting afraid. BYU used to be the program where they had to recruit a guy since he was 8th grade. And, then it was like, oh no, Duke got in the mix in basketball. Oh no, Alabama, Stanford got into the mix in football. It's like, well, they lost out there. Oh well, gonna have to move on. Like, BYU is now that kind of feared program where they got this potential to match you. They're not going to be the highest bidder, as they've doubled down on multiple occasions, but they're going to be in the game. And Brian Santiago has been part of that game, and you want to keep those good times rolling, do you not? And give him a chance, see what he's got. And if it crashes and burns and it falls completely short of where it's been this past year, I don't think this is like the standard of where it should be every single year. But if they suddenly hit the Big 12 cellar in these key sports, yeah, you make some changes. If your president C. Shane Reese, who's been very key in all of this, I think Keith Vorkink, advancement VP, Keith Vorkink has been critical in this too with BYU athletic success. I don't think you just solely give it to Tom Holmoe. If it crashes and burns and BYU becomes this cellar dweller suddenly, well, then maybe you make some changes. And you kind of go, what just happened here? And then maybe you look external. But for right now, BYU athletics is in a great place. So why not promote from within and go with Brian Santiago? And again, who are we to judge on who's Christ-like and who's not? Like, that's one of the key pillars for what BYU wanted in the search. That's their barometer, how they're going to view that. I don't think that's anyone for society to decide who's Christ-like or who's not. Look, I mean, and that's where BYU draws criticisms from the outside. Why do you make that a pillar of what you're going to do for your hire? But again, it's a faith-based institution. Faith, religion, it's going to play a role in everything that they do. But Brian Santiago, next AD for BYU, will be officially introduced on Wednesday at 10 a.m. We'll have full coverage on KSLSports.com. Going to be a busy day down at the BYU Broadcasting Building, and we'll have complete coverage, again, on KSLSports.com, the KSL Sports app. Download that KSL Sports app so you can get push notifications of my bylines and also this podcast as well on KSLSports.com. We're going to be growing this podcast significantly in the coming months, so stay tuned for all of that. More Cougar Tracks coming than ever before to you very soon in the near future. So looking forward to the bright future ahead for Cougar Tracks and bright future ahead for BYU athletics. And again, subscribe to this show. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. It helps out the podcast a ton. And I'll talk to you next time here on the Cougar Tracks Podcast. And it's powered by KSLSports.com.